Welcome back, everyone, to this final episode of the history of the Waldensians. This is about the Reformation and going beyond the Hussite movement and talking about the Waldensians' eventual absorption into the Calvinist movement. For starters, when the Reformation had started, obviously people who were against the Catholic Church, like the Waldensians at this point, were sort of proposed to join the Reformation, kind of like the Unity of Czech Brethren and the Hussites, the Taborites. But there were differences, specifically that Luther believed in interpreting scripture in his own specific way and having sola fide or only faith. But the Waldensians believed that there was no interpretation at all. And they were also more ritualistic in the sense that when they did penance, maybe they would have to say the Our Father a certain number of times, a few dozen times. And that kind of ritualism did not sort of rub the reformers the right way. Luther had known about the Waldensians, and he had contacted the Duke of Piedmont, telling him to protect the Waldensians there because that was one of their strongholds. In 1526, there was one of those yearly meetings in Piedmont in the Clusson Valley between 140 Barbas, and they decided to send two of their own, Guido of Calabria and Martin Gonin, to the reformers in Switzerland, and they met with a certain Guillaume Farel, who was also a Dauphinois himself. Their goal was simply to collect books and gather information about what was happening in the Reformation, because the Dauphinois Waldensians were a little bit isolated up in their communities. They weren't just hiding up in the mountains, obviously, they had their own towns and things, but they were still out of sort of the German orbit of Reformation that was happening. The Reformation had only started about, what, 9 years before this event, so it was a bit new and they had to find out about it. In 1530, and then at another meeting, there were two named Morel and Masson. These two were some of the most important uh, people in the history of the Waldensians because they're the biggest source on their beliefs in the 1500s. That's how we can tell whether some things phased out or didn't phase out. For example, at the beginning of the Waldensian movement, back in the 1200s, there were three species of communion. There was bread, wine, and the fish. But in the 1500s, they hadn't mentioned this, so it seems to have died out. The same thing goes with the Waldensian uh, pontifex, or I guess you could call them the Pope, sort of. They had their own Pope in Calabria, and their bishops, deacons, that whole thing had kind of started to fizzle out too. And we know that because it's not mentioned in the 1530 report. So they were sent, Morel and Masson, they were sent to Basel to meet with Eclampadius and to Strasbourg to meet a certain Bucer. Their meeting with Eclampadius seemed to be more about, sort of, as the author of Waldensian Descent, Gabriel Duccio, says, an insecurity based on the fact that the Waldensians weren't really practicing what they were preaching anymore, in terms of their origins, in terms of where they were now. They had addressed initially to that man 11 questions, which I'll read now from the same book I just mentioned. They go like this. Should ranks of dignity be established amongst ministers of the word, such as episcopacy, presbytery, and deaconry? Had God ordained authorities or magistrates to sentence murderers, thieves, and delinquents to death or other punishments by which they might atone for their crimes? Are civil laws and other invented by men valid in the eyes of God? Is it licit to advise members of the community to kill false brethren who betray them and deliver the Barbus to representatives of the Antichrist? Is it licit for someone to take back himself those essential goods required for his survival, which have been unjustly taken? Is it illicit for believers to go to law? Should the inheritance of children who die intestate go to their mothers? If the mother then remarries, should the sons of the second husband inherit? Is everything added to capital usury? Is all trade which earns money without labor sinful? Is every oath a mortal sin? Are the doctrines of original, venial, and mortal sins, and invincible and wilful ignorance valid? Is it licit to weep for the dead? Are all children from any origin who are not yet capable in reasoning saved by the grace of God and the passion of Christ? And conversely, are those capable of reasoning who do not have faith in Christ condemned? Must young people who seek and desire to live in celibacy take vows? Can marriage lawfully be contracted between blood relations to any degree other than those evoked in Leviticus 18? And Gabriel Odisio continues this. I think it's good to quote. It is clear from this list that the Poor of Lyon concerns bore upon concrete aspects of their practical life and difficulties resulting from their traditional biblicism. The most sensitive issue, however, at the root of the Barbist disquiet, arose from their doubts about the Reformers' double position over free will and predestination. The debate between Catholics and Reformers over this point was increasingly impassioned. The question was essential: can man aid his own salvation? Because you have to remember that the Waldensians had even started just as a Pauperis Christi movement, specifically to minister to the people that they deemed that the Catholic priesthood wasn't doing a very good job of ministering to and doing good works. So when you have this other group that's against the Catholic Church too, you want to be united with them, but they clearly don't believe what you believe about good works, aiding the soul, and a lot of other things. There were a lot of differences between the Waldensians and the Reformers, which makes their whole absorption kind of uh, ironic or strange, and we'll get to that. Further down in the same document, also quoted from Gabriel Alicio's book, Moral and Masson said to Ecolampadius, "Furthermore, nothing troubles our weakness due, I admit, to our ignorance, more than what I have heard and read in Luther on free will and divine predestination. And indeed we believe that God instills into each person a certain natural virtue, more to one and less to another, however, as experience has clearly taught us that one man differs from the next, and as the parable of the talents seems to indicate, and as we have also seen by experience how in herbs, plants, stones, and all other things, there is its own natural energy put there by God, with which we can do much. So we believe that men can do something with the said virtue, especially when it is stimulated and incited by God, as he himself has said, Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and he who will not open with this instilled and stimulated virtue will, in the end, be treated according to his works. Otherwise, if this be wrong, I do not see how we can understand so many affirmative and negative precepts, such as Erasmus discusses. As for predestination, we believe that long, long before the creation of heaven and earth, the Almighty had foreseen how many would be saved or damned, and this because of their own fault, because they would not obey and observe the commandments. But if everything happens by necessity, as Luther says, and if those predestined to eternal life cannot be damned and vice versa, since divine predestination cannot fail to be realized, then what is the point of so many writings and preachers and healers of the body? So they were clearly a bit confused about the predestination and the lack of the necessity for works in the Lutheran doctrine, and they were confused, wanting to join but wanting to inquire, not really sure what to do about it. Ecolampadius pretty much just answered that free will was contrary to grace and that man is responsible for his damnation, but only God is responsible for saving man. And it turns out Masson was captured and killed in Strasbourg, but his companion Morel was able to come back and translate his report that he had written in Latin into Romance so that it could be understood by the non-Latin speakers of his community. So a couple years later, there was another synod in 1532. We have a record of it from a certain Pierre Griot, which I think I've talked about in other episodes. He writes about this synod that is basically the end of Waldensianism as we know it, as it had evolved to become, and that now would be something completely different and sort of analogous to the reformers of Switzerland. So in this synod, there were two monks that were there. One was wearing white, and his name was Augustine, and one was in black, and his name was Thomas. The first one was probably maybe a Dominican, or maybe a former Dominican rather, because of what he was saying. Uh, there were there were two other people there called doctors. One was Adam, which we apparently know was a certain Antoine Saunier, and the other one was named Charles, but that Charles might be Guillaume Farel, was who had talked with the Waldensians prior, but we don't really know for sure. And these monks were arguing that justification was by faith and that works were just a sign of faith. And they even accused, like I said before, the Waldensians of being ritualistic and sort of being like Catholics with superstition and ritualism, which, you know, kind of an accusation against the Catholics there. Ritualistic, sure. I'm not really sure about superstitious, but they put they made a connection between the superstitions and the rituals. And so this meeting pretty much just gave up everything the Waldensians or the Poor of Lyon had believed prior. There were 20 articles written up by Valdo Vinet, one of the Barbas, and he said that external works were now optional, not forbidden, but um, they can be done without sin. They believed in predestination, which is probably the biggest issue. That, as he wrote, those chosen to be saved cannot fail to be saved. He who establishes free will entirely denies predestination and divine grace. So now the Poor of Lyon are officially reformers. They had gone down to two sacraments because before Morel and Masson had said that they believed that there were more than two sacraments, but now that was thrown out. The Eucharistic views of specifically Ulrich Zwingli were adopted by the Poor of Lyon, if we can even call them that now. Maybe we can call them the Waldensians now because they're not the same thing as the Poor of Lyon. They're an entirely different thing now. They believed that oaths were now permissible, that ministers could have property. They finally got rid of confession. They didn't believe in prayer at certain hours of the day, like the Poor of Lyon have been doing, in terms of, um, similar to Catholics, where they might have like a liturgy of the hours. They didn't accept that anymore. There were no more set days of fasting, no more laying out of hands, uh, no more virginal orders. They actually called that diabolical. No more itinerant missions, and they now decided that they should no longer be living double lives and not practicing what they were preaching. Now they were going to outwardly live what they believed, even though what they believed was completely changed at this 1532 Chanferan Synod. And they even had themselves a new Bible written because they started believing that the one that was obtained and obviously maybe changed a bit throughout time up to that point with the language and everything from Vaudet all those centuries ago was outdated and even incorrect, and they believe they had to go back to Hebrew and Greek because they're sort of humanists in that respect. They wanted at first to have a Bible with one French column and one Latin column, but then they did actually just opted for a full Bible in French with no Latin at all. And it first appeared in 1535, which is interesting because they chose French, even though French wasn't the language of themselves. That Bible itself is very reformistic in its tone. It was made by a cousin of John Calvin himself called Pierre Robert Olivetan. It changes some words, like he uses sacrificateur instead of prêtre or priest. He uses specifically non Latin terms to try to go back to the source of Greek and Hebrew and to make the Catholic Church seem like it's sort of a development over time. And the margins of the Bible itself are pretty indicative of that. The historian Bernard Rousseau wrote, "This translation increased the pressure the French group were putting on the Waldensians, with the intention of confirming their clear adhesion to the Rhenish and Swiss Reformation." So it's pretty clear that at this point, the Reformation is trying to get the Waldensians to adhere to them as much as possible, and it definitely seemed to be working with this Bible that wasn't even in their own language to start with. The Bible itself was going to be, at first, a double text, double column, with one side French, one side Latin, but eventually they just went with only the French, and it appeared in 1535 at first, and the idea was to have it as much from the Greek and Hebrew as possible, not from Latin like their other Bible that they finally believed was incorrect or outdated or not to the source or ad fontes enough. Even by 1540, though, there was a meeting with Calvin and Matthew Cervenka, a Czech theologian, in Strasbourg, but Calvin still saw that even 8 years after the Synod of Chanferan, the Poor of Lyon, or Waldensians, were very much still into works and merit rather than just trusting in grace. However, in 1540, there would be an event that would link the Waldensians and the Calvinists much closer. So there was November 18th of 1540 a decree against Waldensians and Lutherans, a number of 19 of them, and that their village had to be destroyed. And it was the first time that a whole village was under fire for a heresy. It wasn't exactly Lutherans and Waldensians specifically being targeted, but it was just all heretics, and they called the heretics by those names, similar to the Vaudois and back in the later Middle Ages. The degree ended up being delayed by a bit, by 5 years even, until January 31st, 1545, when it was put into action. The president of the Parliament of Aix was the one who sort of set it off, because the Count of Grignan, governor of Provence, was away, so he was sort of in charge. On April 13th, after Easter, so about 3 months after this decree was put into action, there was an army that went to Merindol and slaughtered 2,700 people and made hundreds of prisoners, ruined families, destroyed the harvest, destroyed the villages, and this was actually an international event that pretty much everybody ended up knowing about after a certain point. It was called the Execution of Cabrières and Merindol, and it was so egregious that the Parliament of Aix actually was tried by the Parliament of Paris for the tragedy that happened here. And that wouldn't be the last violent incident. There was another in Calabria and Apulia, the two probably biggest Waldensian communities that existed because they were so big that they were basically living in public, not really hiding. The chaplain of the Lord of La Guardia had noticed that there were heretics, and he alerted the Cardinal Alessandrino, who would actually be the future Pope Pius V. And this cardinal, ordered two Jesuits to go there and to preach and convert. However, they just sort of intimidated the people, and they all went into hiding in the towns of San Sisto and other places. So there were a lot of Waldensians in La Guardia who had teamed up with the people there to make one Waldensian last stand, so to speak, against Spinelli. And Spinelli sent 50 prisoners serving him, and they said, "Oh, we're prisoners. We've been sent here to suffer our fate." But then once they were inside, they opened up the city to Spinelli, and his army of 300 massacred the town on June 14th, 1561, where 1,374 were killed, including hundreds of children. When Trent reopened in 1562 for another session, the Archbishop Reggio was sent by the Pope to figure out how to run the area. He freed prisoners, gave people a second chance to recant, which was actually unheard of in canon law for people like this. But he couldn't actually get the tax officers in the area to give back what they had taken from the Waldensians. So there were people that were pretty much just living without their old possessions. They couldn't get them back. They weren't allowed to, even if they knew where they were. And marriage between the Waldensians themselves was forbidden for 25 years, it seems. And in September of 1560, the Duke Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy ordered Count Costa de la Trinita to reinstate Catholic order in the valleys, and that ended up having another campaign against the Waldensians there. They wrote to Emmanuel Philibert saying they were just defending themselves and they only wanted reform. Some of them fled to Geneva, some of them fought back, some of them fled to other places. And on January 21st of 1561, there was an alliance between the French Protestants and the Waldensians. In February of that year, they started fighting and defending themselves. They didn't really win much, they sort of just survived. And the Duke finally made a peace at Cavour on June 5th, 1561, where the Duke pardoned the rebels and allowed them to publicly worship in remote areas, which actually was completely against the Peace of Augsburg. Lastly, there was an event in 1629 where Louis XIV had decided to revamp Catholicism in Piedmont, so he ordered uh, missions, and in 1655, the Marquis of Pianeza had ordered the Waldensians to quarter his troops. And this ended with the Piedmontese Easter, which was another violent incident in the Waldensian history. And it's the last event that I'll narrate here just because we're going pretty far into uh, closer to modern times, and I'm not really trying to push it that far. So that's it for the historical violence. As for the rest of their religious history, they still seem to have lived double lives a bit after Chanfaran, but eventually they did start to fully abandon their old ways, so to speak. That's visible in their testaments and in their wills. Especially in the 1560s, they started using things. They used to say that they didn't want to be buried in the ways of the old superstition, but instead to be buried in the Reformed way. And they started abandoning certain phrases like for the salvation of the soul. There were various confessions of faith every few years that we have from them. Sometimes they just used the Apostles' Creed itself. Sometimes they changed. Um, the First National Synod of the Reformed Churches of France, it was held in Paris in 1559, and they were a part of it. But they were at that point really no different than the other Reformed churches. They were pretty much identical. So now they were actually more structured and more open. They actually had churches because don't forget the Poor of Lyon never really had churches. They just part of their thing was they believed that you could pray well, other religions believed that too, but they specifically believed that there was no need for a church to go to every Sunday or just in general. And so now they actually did have churches to go to, parish churches that were just houses or secret buildings. And that brings us to the end of the series of the Poor of Lyon, the Waldensians, without any kind of restorationist bias. I hope I did a good job of it. I cite again Gabriel Adicio's book, Waldensian Descent, if you want to read all about this stuff in much more detail. It's much better than, say, fundamentalist Baptist documentaries on YouTube that aren't really faithful to the truth at all. Not that I'm trying to be partisan one way or the other to one denomination or the other, but some things have to be said, and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of using the Waldensians to be what they aren't. So, yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening if you made it this far. If you didn't listen to the rest, I recommend you do. And until the next series of videos, goodbye.